Good morning. Welcome to Lizzie U. I'm Merle Breinhold, and I'm excited to accompany you on your first adventures with your TinLizzie. We're going to talk chiefly today about cleaning, oiling, and adjusting your machine and helping you to understand about tensions. You can look at our TinLizzie over here and see that it looks like it's ready to take off. We have it up so that you can see inside what we call the basket where we put our bobbin case to see how we are able to clean it. Make sure that you have a brush. That you're able to get in here and brush up underneath the needle plate. You can see I've come up with a little bit of lint there. We don't want any of that lint to drop down into your basket because it can actually stop the hook from spinning around. It can get caught on your quilt. So you clean up inside the basket where your bobbin case goes and around inside. There's nothing wrong with using canned air in this machine. There's no sensors to disturb. However, it will just blow the lint out into the air and you'll have to clean it up another time. So my advice is to use a brush or some kind of a lint catcher to dust around in that vital area. While we're in the bobbin case area looking closely, I'd like you to take a look at the shape of the basket. Right here is a little opening that accommodates an outcropping on your bobbin case. You know that your bobbin's in correct position when that outcropping is right in up against that opening for it. It is possible to put your bobbin case in incorrectly. I'm going to twist it a bit. I might think that's in, and it's not incorrectly if that outcropping isn't sitting right there inside that opening. We're going to be talking more about the bobbin case, but I thought since you could see the basket area so clearly right now that I would show that to you. Also, since we have this open, if your machine has been sitting for a long length of time, 2 months or longer, it's advisable to oil behind this vertical bar here that's holding the spindle. Just behind it, 1 drop. That will help clean out any residue that might have accumulated there. It will also help to wick the oil that is down in the well underneath and bring it forward. So you would just put that tip right in here, 1 drop. You don't want several drops. It will get on your thread and you won't be happy with how that looks. Okay, let's lower the machine so that you can see the other areas to clean. I'm going to step in front of the camera for a second. Any place where your thread drags, you'll accumulate dust and lint. Up here in the thread guide, through these thread guides, but you'll notice especially lint collecting around your tension disc because it's holding tightly to the thread. You'll need to clean in there and around. If you lift your pressure foot lever, then it makes it more loose in the tension disc area and you're able to get in deeper to clean. Do not forget to lower that pressure foot. You'll also find quite a bit of lint down here by your pressure foot. It drags against the fabric, and you can see I've got some there. It drags against the fabric, picks up lint from the batting and the thread. So it's very good to make sure you keep that clean. You don't want clumps of lint dropping onto your fabric while you're quilting and having you quilt them in. It's a very frustrating occurrence when that happens. You'll also need to pay some attention to your tension disc where you wind your bobbin over here towards the back of the machine. It won't get quite as linty because there's not quite as much thread pulled through, but you will have some lint gather there. We're going to be talking about the Phoenix frame later and how to clean that on another adventure. We'll talk about loading the quilt then as well. So we're just concentrating mostly with the machine today. I like to use little scraps of batting to literally dust the whole machine to keep it clean and nice looking. We're going to go and look down at the needle plate area for a moment. Down in this area is your needle plate. Some people call it the throat plate. On a regular basis, maybe every month or so, unscrew the screws and take your needle plate off. You'll be able to wipe up underneath it. Sometimes it gathers a tiny bit of oil as it gets splashed on there, and then it is able to adhere many pieces of lint to it. In this way you'll be able to actually wipe it off and keep it clean. You'll also be able to look down into your hook assembly area and check for any loose threads that might be accumulating where you don't want them to be. Okay, how do we oil the machine? There are two main places, and the frequency will differ depending on where you live. If you live in a more humid climate, you'll have to oil less frequently. We advise you to pull your dipstick out, and I have a little magnet here that I'm using because sometimes these dipsticks are pretty low in the bed and it's hard to grab them. If you see any oil on your dipstick, then you're just fine. You don't need to oil your machine. If you can't quite tell if there's oil, you can put your hand out and drag your dipstick along it, and if you see shiny spots, you'll know there's oil on your dipstick. If there's no oil on your dipstick, you need to put 4 or 5 drops in this well. It has a wicking mechanism that takes the oil to the moving parts of your hook area. The second place is up here above your needle on the top of the machine, and you will see either a red eyelet or red paint to help you know which one of these openings is actually an oil well. This also has a wicking mechanism that moves back to the moving parts of your machine in the back. Again, 4 or 5 drops of oil when your dipstick is empty in both places. Now there's one other place you may oil your machine, not nearly as frequently. It's back here just above your hand wheel. There is a little plug that you can pull out and just put 1 or 2 drops. As you hear maybe a little bit of metallic grinding, you're going to get used to the sound of your machine, and when it starts to sound not quite the same, not quite as smooth, you'll put 2 drops of oil back here to help wick the oil that's in the oil well back here for you. Again, this isn't as frequent as when you check your dipstick. Okay. Now we're going to talk about bobbin cases and winding a bobbin. Excuse as I walk past the camera. You have an onboard bobbin winder on your TinLizzie. You're able to wind your bobbin as you sew, or pre-wind bobbins, whatever your choice is. You'll need to put your thread just below the thread guide you're using. It needs to be directly above your spool. And you're going to need to enter this first thread guide just above your tension disc in the back of the machine. Looks like I need to trim it. So we're going in towards the tension disc because that's where we want to be. And I'm going to take the thread and floss it, making sure that it's in those discs. Then I'm going to leave out of this thread guide to head toward the bobbin. It's best to have an empty bobbin. I don't recommend winding thread upon thread. All right, so now you come back here. This thread guide should be directly lined up with the center of your bobbin. If it is not, you're going to have a volcano-shaped wind so that it's either heavy on the top or heavy on the bottom. If it is heavy on the top, this thread guide is too high. If it's heavy on the bottom, this thread guide is too low. You may fix that, adjust it. This has a little flathead screwdriver right here, that you can loosen and tip it back and forth slightly until you get the right adjustment. It should come from the factory correct, but in shipping often things happen. All right, so now this is directly in the center of your bobbin, then we're going to wind around several times. Now this thread's cotton, so it's going to catch very easily. If you're using polyester, tri-lobal, you'll probably have to go around that several times more because it's slippery. Now once you have it wound around the bobbin, I like to go clockwise around. We will engage this lever, and then when we are in the manual or constant stitch mode where we're talking about percentage of machine speed, this will wind for you when you touch your go button. You want to wind it depending on which model you have. If you have a servo motor, which is on the ESP and the ES models, then you're going to want to have it at about 60 or 65% so that you don't stretch your thread. If you have the original TinLizzie, a DLS or a LS, then you're going to be able to put it up a little higher, or an apprentice, you're able to put a little higher percentage because the motor speed's a little slower on those. Now if your bobbin winds too full or not full enough, you're able to adjust this lever that disengages when your bobbin is full by using a Allen wrench on the end. Do not adjust this screw that's so obvious. On the end there's an Allen wrench you're able to loosen and adjust this lever so that it disengages at an appropriate time for you. So now we have our bobbins wound. We want to look at our bobbin cases. Is this a good spot? All right, if you look inside your bobbin case, you have what we call an anti-backlash spring. It looks kind of like a little man with his hands above his head. Its job is to keep your bobbin from continuing to spin when you stop or hesitate, especially when you are in the regulated mode. And so it keeps extra thread from winding off of your bobbin before you need it. That can cause loops on the back of your quilt. You can see on the left-hand side we have some flanges that are farther apart than on the right-hand side. That helps you know how to replace this in your bobbin case. Now just as a note, there are some pre-wound bobbins that have magnets on them to do the same purpose, to keep the bobbin from continuing to wind. If you're using those, take out your anti-backlash spring. All right, so you replace it by lining those flanges with some openings in the bobbin case. And I like to just push it down with my finger nail until I feel that they push down in place. And right now, I don't know if you can see with the camera, but this spring back here is a good 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch away from the back of the bobbin case. That means that this spring is not in correctly. It shouldn't be that far away, so I'm going to continue to push it with my fingernail until it is in better. Okay, now again, I don't know if the camera can pick this up, but now it is properly in place. This little spring is more like a 1/16 of an inch away from the back. Now it is in the proper position. Tension is a tug of war. So what we're going to do is talk a lot about that in the next few minutes. And I want you to notice that we adjust our bobbin tension first. I like to have my thread coming off at like a number 9 and setting that bobbin in. Now it comes up through the slit on the side, up under what we call the tension strap. Be careful not to pull it too far to the right. It can get stuck. Now notice this tension strap has 2 screws. A large screw that is your tension adjustment. The small screw is your set screw that holds the strap on. Your tension adjustment screw has a very short body and very short threads, so you only want to adjust it in fine motions. For instance, if you need to loosen your tension, you'll need to turn it to the left maybe 1 or 2 minutes on the clock at a time. If you turn it a whole half an hour, you're going to have your screw fall out, and that's kind of a hard thing when it gets lost in the carpet. Now before I use the piggy tail, which is this little wire on the front, I lay it in my hand flat to test the tension. And I hold on to the thread and I lift my bobbin case up. Can you see that it stood up on its side, and yet it's following my hand down? I used to teach to shake the bobbin down, but as I have learned more about bobbin tension, I prefer a little looser tension, and that's something for you to discover yourself, because actually tension is achieving equal tension between your needle and your bobbin case. There isn't one specific number that you need to shoot for. So once I have the tension I like, you can put the thread between the piggy tail and the bobbin and wiggle it, and your thread goes right in. Now why do we use the piggy tail? It helps to line the thread up with the needle. I've used it with and without the piggy tail, and I prefer the results from using the piggy tail. And I've showed you how to put the bobbin case in already. Excuse me. I need to get a drink here. Oh, okay. Now we're going to talk about threading the machine for a moment, and then we'll go into detail about tension. Notice that we're using cones. Excuse me. We're using cones because they are meant to feed off the top. They are cross-wound, and I'm not sure if the camera can pick it up. Maybe this, oh, there you go. You can see that the threads are crossed back and forth as it is spun onto the spool. It's important to use that type of thread on your TinLizzie, because if you use the straight wound, similar to what you'd use on your domestic machine, it will literally untwist your thread, unless you have a special thread stand, which I think Superior Thread actually has in stock. So what we need is to put this through the thread guide directly above the thread. If you accidentally put it in another one, it will add tension to your thread, and I've even seen it break the needle. All right, we have this first thread guide that has 3 holes in it. I prefer using 2. Keep in mind we're heading towards the needle, so we want to come through the farthest right hole first. We're not going to use this one and then go backwards. We need to be heading toward our needle. So we're going to put it through there and through the second one. Now, you don't have to put it over the top like I do. I do just because it's convenient for the way I do things. You can do it the way that's comfortable for you. If you want to come out and back in, that works too. Now the second thread guide has 3 holes as well. I again just use 2 unless I have a difficult thread that wants to bounce and stretch. So I am thinking I'm going down to the needle, so I'm going to put the thread down through the first hole. Then I'm going to come back down through the second hole. I'm trying to stay out of the view of the camera with my hand, so I may look a little awkward here. Now one thing to notice, sometimes thread will get wrapped around this thread guide without you noticing and cause thread breaks. So just double check your threading path when you're finished threading. Now the next thing we're going to do is come down to the tension disc. I'm going to floss it between the discs. I do not lift my pressure foot lever. I floss it just so that the lever doesn't get left up. Then after I come through the disc, I'm going to come through this little wire that's called a check spring. Its job is to lock the stitch into the quilt, so it moves with every stitch. Then I'm coming down to this L-shaped guide. So here we go. We're going to floss it, come through the check spring. I double check that it's in there by pulling on the thread. Come down to the L-shaped guide. Now I'm going to come through this guide that's above the tension disc. It's to prepare for the take-up lever. There you go. Now, I'm going to move the machine slightly, Mike. Can you see the take-up lever? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now we come through the take-up lever. I like to hold on the thread here because it's so easy for it to get dripped down here underneath your tension screw. So I hold on to the thread and come through the take-up lever. The take-up lever's job is to pull the thread off of the spool. So I've seen it where someone forgets to thread that take-up lever and they don't have any way to pull that thread off. It's totally up to the needle to keep pulling off, and it's just not going to work very well. All right, so once we're in the take-up lever, we're coming down the side guides. And now, in front of the needle is a little eyelet hole. Some people have tried to put it through this hole on the side of the shaft, and they've actually been successful, but it's not very useful. You need to come through this little guide here in front of the needle. And usually I'm more successful when I can point the thread down instead of straight back. And there we go. And then through the needle's eye from the front to the back. We'll see how lucky I am today. Not too bad. All right. One thing to notice is make sure that that thread isn't wrapped around your needle. That will cause skip stitches. So I like to check my threading path before I start sewing to make sure I haven't looped anything around where it doesn't belong, and to make sure that the thread is flossed into the tension disc. Flossing, similar to flossing your teeth. You want to hold on to two ends of that thread and actually wiggle it till you can see it fall in between those discs. One way I can tell is the thread is almost at a 12 o'clock position. If your thread is not flossed, I'm going to just put it on the periphery. Can you see? Oh my goodness. When I teach classes, frequently people thread it this way and think they're in the disc, and they're just on the periphery of the disc. So when we floss it, it's at 12 o'clock. All right, so now I'm going to turn the machine a bit so you can see the eyelet hole. Is that a good place? The eyelet hole is just above the needle in this position here. The one in front. Ignore the one on the shaft. It's this one in front. That's how to thread your machine. Now, let's talk a little bit about threads. I'm going to come over here for a moment, because what we're going to do is talk about the different things that affect tension. And the first thing we think about is thread, isn't it? We think that's the whole ball of wax, and it really isn't. Tension is a tug of war. When we played tug of war as a child, we had this big rope and we had a flag tied to the center of it, and the two teams pulled and tugged till we got the flag to our side of the field. Well, in sewing, tension, tug of war, we want that flag to stay right in the center. That means there's going to be equal pull on your bobbin thread with equal pull on your needle thread. So we need to talk about what kind of threads to use in your bobbin. I've been successful with most threads in my bobbin. Sometimes the trilobals will have a little tangling problem, but if you monitor it well, they do pretty well. And we'll talk about trilobals in 1 second. But the thing to remember is you need to have equal drag in your bobbin with your needle thread, or less drag. Now, what I mean by drag is either the weight of the thread being equal or the fibers being the same. Okay, so the bobbin thread needs to be equal or less than your needle thread. All right, let's talk about drag for a moment. The example I have is King Tut. King Tut is a long Egyptian cotton. It has a little more drag because it has some little ends of fiber sticking out, and so it takes more to pull it through, so you'll have to loosen your tension a bit with King Tut. It is 40 weight. We also have a polyester thread called So Fine. It is a 50 weight. Since it doesn't have the fibers like cotton, it has less drag and it has a smaller weight. So It is an ideal one to use in your bobbin when you're using King Tut because it has less drag than King Tut. Or you could use another King Tut for your bobbin because it would be equal. The thing that doesn't work very well with tension is having more drag in your bobbin than you have in your needle thread. All right, permacore is also a polyester thread. It has a polyester core wrapped with polyester fibers. It has a little less drag to King Tut as well. And I'm going to talk about weight in a moment, so don't worry about that. We also have in our store here trilobal threads. Magnifico is an example of that. A trilobal thread has fibers forced through something kind of like a sieve to give it 3 sides. And then they twist 3 fibers together, and that gives it a shiny look to it. You can see that these are the same fibers, and yet the trilobal is much shinier. It is much more slippery as well. It makes a beautiful stitch, but it needs a little more control, so you need to tighten your tension a bit with it. Okay, how do we determine weight? The European measurement of weight of thread asks the question is how much thread does it take to weigh a gram? So you can see that a heavyweight thread would take less thread to weigh a gram. So for instance, King Tut is 40 weight because it takes less thread to weigh a gram than the finer So Fine that is 50 weight. Now sometimes you're going to run into a terminology TEX, T-E-X. Permacore actually has that measurement on its cone. You'll usually see it with industrial machines. TEX is an American measurement. The question it asks is, how much does a meter of thread weigh? So now the measurement reverses. With the weight, the finer the thread, the larger the number. With TEX, the heavier the thread, the larger the number. It's opposite. They come together, 40 weight comes together with TEX between 27 and 30. So that's about weight, but we also need to consider the drag, whether it's going to drag harder or slip through easily like Magnifico. Another thing to consider with your tension is batting. I have a little display here. I'm not sure how well it will be shown on the camera. But for instance, this Dream Wool and Dream Puff have a higher loft than, for instance, this cotton. This is actually a double layer of cotton. So it's very thin. It is much easier to get good tension with higher loft fabric and higher loft batting because there is more room and leeway for the stitch to lock inside your quilt sandwich. If you have a skinny quilt sandwich, there's hardly any leeway for that thread to lock. So just be aware that if you're using a thread that's a little hard to deal with, that it's easier on a higher loft batting. My favorite combination is 70-30, 70% cotton, 30% polyester. This is from Quilter's Dream batting, as they have some beautiful battings that we have in our store.
A question is asked, what about Omni thread?
Omni thread is similar to Permacore. It is polyester as well. I love it. I use it all the time. To tell you that Permacore is carried in our retail store here because it's more affordable. It has less on the spool than Omni. But I do use Omni thread, and it works well in the bobbin or in the needle. Just make sure you keep the needle and bobbin thread either balanced or needle heavier than the bobbin. That's what's important to remember. All right, we're going to talk about needles. They also have something to do with tension adjustment. Here is an illustration of a picture of Gross-Becker's packaging. We endorse Gross-Beckert needles because they last quite a while. They are titanium. By this demonstration, you can see, or illustration, you can see that they have a stronger shaft, so they don't flex very much. And then they also have a smaller scarf area. If you get your needle out and take a look at it so that you can be familiar with what your needle looks like. The scarf is actually the back of the needle, and I'm putting a needle down here, but I don't know if you can see very well. I'll put it up against the dark. You can see that it dents in. That is the scarf. That is the back of your needle. That's where the hook spins around and catches the thread. So we need to make sure we put that in the back as we change our needle. Down the front of the needle is a groove where your thread hides when your needle goes down into your fabric. And so that groove changes according to the size of your needle. So you need to pay attention not only to what fabric you're using to choose your needle, but also the thread you're using. Superior Thread actually puts the appropriate needle to use for its thread right on its packaging, and they have a nice catalog online that you can, to help you inform yourself about that. All right.
Another question is, do you recommend YLI threads? And did you mean heavier when you're talking about the Omni?
Omni isn't heavier than Permacore. It's about the same. We don't have YLI in the store, but I've used it, and especially the pre-wound bobbins I like. So I recommend those as well. There's only one brand I have difficulty with, and I don't know if it's appropriate for me to say that on a webinar. Let's look at the packaging of the needle for a moment so you can understand what you see. 134 is the length of your needle. MR is multiple directional, and if you think about how you move your machine around, that there are some times when your needle is going to be down in your fabric when you move it, and so you don't want much flex, or you'll get a skip stitch, or maybe even your needle hit your hook. So MR is multiple directional. The SAN, SAN 11, SAN means special application needle. And then we're used to looking at this number over here, the 120/19, or whatever size, the diameter that you're used to looking at. And most of us, that's what we're familiar with, is the size of our needle as far as diameter, not necessarily the length. But for Tin Lizzies, we need a 134 for the timing to work properly. Okay, another thing that affects your tension is the fabric you're using. If you are using very loose weave fabric, for instance, homespun or flannel, the thread is going to come through much more easily than through a heavier fabric like denim, or let's say a painted fabric like batiks. So it'll be easier for you to get good tension if you actually try to stay the same fabrics on your quilt back as you do with your quilt top. You don't have to. There's not a rule against it, but just realize that you'll have to work a little harder at getting good tension. For instance, the fabric we usually quilt with, the cotton, has 60 weave, which means 60 per millimeter threads going each direction. If you look at the store and the sheets, they are actually measuring inches, but you can see up to 2,000 threads per inch. You can see that would be much more dense fabric. So it would be hard if you put a sheet on the back of your 60 weight fabric to pull the thread through. It's going to pull hard on that painted fabric, and then, or the more dense fabric, I'm sorry, and it would pull it on through to the top once it gets free. So try to keep the same density, and paint increases density, all right? But that's just to help you. You can combine them if you're just willing to take a little time to adjust your tension. And by the way, don't be afraid to adjust your tension. Your needle tension is much less sensitive. In fact, Mike, I'm going to turn the machine so you can look at the dial on the machine. These numbers are just to help you know how many times you've turned that knob. Okay, so don't be looking at that number and saying, I need it to be on 2. Notice, I can have it 2, and then I can go clear around and have it on 2 again. All right? It's not as sensitive as your bobbin screw to adjust your tension. So when you have to adjust your needle tension, you're probably going to be turning it at least 1 full turn, and sometimes 2 to get a change. I know I've had people call and so frustrated because they've been just inching it along and it's taken them all day to adjust their tension. Now I have some samples of poor and good tension to show you. Do you want them right here? Okay. This one looks fairly decent on top. If you look a little closer, it's hard on the camera, but you can see that the bobbin thread is pulling through on some of this circles. That reminds me, when you test your tension, go into a figure 8 shape as you stitch. Then you get all your directions, because tension isn't created equal in all directions. But you can see how the bobbin thread pops through on these circles and doesn't look too bad on the straightaways. Uh-oh. This is the back. Does anybody know what happened here? I had the pressure foot lifter up. There was no tension on the needle thread, and so, uh-oh, we have a nest. That's why my rule is, if I'm going to lift my pressure foot lifter, I keep my hand on it until I lower it to make sure it doesn't get forgotten. All right, here's another sample. There's yellow thread on the top here, and you can see tiny little blue specks all along, because on the back we have blue thread. That's telling me that I need to loosen my needle thread because it's pulling too hard on my bobbin thread. That's why I adjust my bobbin to what I like first, and then all I have to deal with is my needle thread. So I would adjust my needle thread left loose to loosen it. Excuse me. These allergies are getting to me. All right. Another poor example. It looks okay from the top. When I turn it over, oh no. Any guesses what's wrong here? Yes, the needle thread tension is way too loose. So to avoid having this happen on our quilt, we'll need to test our tension with a figure 8 every time we start our quilt. Some people like to do it every bobbin change. I guess that would be the safest way, but I haven't found a need for that per se. So if I tighten my needle thread tension, that would resolve this problem. All right, now here's an example of good tension. The top has black thread, the back bobbin has white. And I can't see any sign of white on the top. Oh, I'm sorry, it's blue. And And on the back, I can see no sign of black. So it is possible to get good tension with really drastically different threads, colors. All right, I had a thought that just slipped by me. Hopefully it'll come back. Are there any questions?
One question was about resetting the maintenance. You want to show them where to go to reset the timer for the maintenance?
Okay. The maintenance is on a timer. It doesn't measure your oil, okay? If you notice on your home screen, you can see a timer down here. This says 2 hours and 6 minutes and 22 seconds. Across the top, about in the middle, you can see a little hourglass. If you touch it, you can see the run time. You can reset it. Stitch counter, you can also reset. Is that what we're talking about?
No, the maintenance time. So go to the file folder.
Oh, okay. So, advanced.
Maintenance. And this is where you would reset.
Okay, so this one says next maintenance service is due in 5.7 hours. So when you've got to the point of maintenance, then you would reset it and would start counting again.
So go ahead and reset it now.
Now if you look at it, 8 hours. Now you're going to get some notifications about it's time to oil. It's on this maintenance counter. Like I said, it's a time counter. It's not a measurement of your oil wells. Okay, any other questions?
Another question. Why does my top thread keep breaking? Are you about to help? I have a TinLizzie18 LS. DLS.
All right, the very first thing I do when I have a thread break is change the needle.
Go sit down.
And because usually it's the culprit, I have to admit that it's usually the culprit. Now, if you've changed the needle and it's still breaking, what I would consider is lessening your tension. So let's go back to your bobbin tension and make sure it doesn't have to be shaken down to your hand, that it will actually drop gently. We'll start there, and then when you go back to your needle tension, you're able to loosen it a bit. Now, if that doesn't help, then we need to check some of your thread guides. Rub your finger against all the thread guides and see if there is a burr that might be shredding it. Even your needle plate down underneath the needle area, make sure there's no burr there. Same thing with the hook. Run your finger across it, make sure there's no burrs that would break your thread. Also, when I have a break, I check underneath my spool to make sure that the thread hasn't dropped underneath the spool and wound itself against the spindle there. And checking your thread path also. But if it's something that keeps breaking, I would try multiple threads. Sometimes it's the spool of thread you have. I found that black is actually the hardest one when it comes to breaking, and my theory is that maybe it's so saturated with color. I don't know. Also, if you've dropped a spool of thread on the ground, it may actually break and loosen the fibers on your spool, so as you're using it, it's weak and break easily. And then also I would make sure you use quality thread. If you go to a store and you've got a thread that's on sale and you notice that they're storing it in the window, I wouldn't purchase it because it's probably damaged. One way to check thread for whether it's old or damaged is, I was going to, let me grab, oh, here's some. All right. Most thread will break if you just pull it quickly, right? But if you take thread and just gently give it tension, and it's weak, maybe it's been in the sunshine, maybe it's got too much dust on it, it will slowly break. You'll see the different fibers, the twists start to break. And that'll indicate that that thread needs to be thrown away because it's old. So that's another way to check. If your suggestions the suggestions I've given you today don't help you, please email me at Myrl, M-Y-R-L, at TinLizzie18.com. TinLizzie, the number 18.com. Myrl, M-Y-R-L. And then we can help work together to help you resolve your problems. I'm more than happy to help. Any other questions?
Which oil do you recommend purchasing for this machine?
Any machine oil works really well. We carry this Zoom Spout machine oil in our store, and the thing I like about it is this Zoom Spout. See how I can pull it way up and bend it to any spot I need to get to, and then I can put it back down, and then there's a nice little cap that goes on it to keep it from spilling. And this is, I believe, $3.99 at our store. So this is a good one to use. One thing to notice though, if your machine oil starts to discolor, in fact this one kind of looks a little yellow, it's pretty close to needing to be tossed out. It should be clear and pretty. This one's been kind of down in the window area where we have our machines in front, so it's probably had a little too much sunshine. Any other questions?
When is the correct time to change the needle?
About every 8 hours of sewing or so. I've gotten in the habit of changing mine between each project. There's just metal fatigue that happens. As you get used to the sounds of your machine, you're going to start hearing when that point isn't quite as sharp as it used to be. You'll have kind of a thudding sound rather than the smooth stitching sound. Then you just toss it away and get another one. Any other questions?
How often do you oil at the back of the machine, as I have not done that?
Really sparingly. It's there so that if you hear any metallic grinding or new noises in the back by the hand wheel, drop 1 or 2 drops back there, and that'll help wick the oil that's supposed to come back there into it. And that's not very often, it's just mostly by sound. Any others? Well, it's been really fun being with you today, and I love helping you, so please don't hesitate to email me with questions. This recording will be on our website within a week or so, and you will also have a document there available for you about what I know about tensions. So the things that we talked about will be there on the website.
Okay, there's a question, would you touch on the proper height of the pressure foot?
Sure. The pressure foot is a hopping foot. It moves up and down slightly. Mike, let's move it over to the needle. So what we need to adjust the proper height of the pressure foot when the needle is all the way down. So we're going to put it down to its lowest point, and of course if you had the machine plugged in, you could touch your needle down option and it would put it down. At this point, you should be able to sit a dime underneath that space. And that's the proper height. If it's too high, you're liable to have skip stitches. Now that being said, you can raise that pressure foot up a little bit if you've got some high seams that you are worried about clearing. You can raise it temporarily, but if you're skipping stitches, then you know it's too high.
When I'm winding a bobbin while clipping, it seems to drag the performance.
Wow, I haven't had that happen before. What do you suggest, Mike? One thing to think about, though, when you are winding a bobbin while you're sewing, is to make sure you keep a consistent speed. Because if you go really fast and then really slow, then you might have stretched thread in one spot of your bobbin and not stretched thread in another part, and it could give you grief. And this is particularly true if you're using the robotic system, the Quilt Magician. It might stitch quickly at one point and slowly in another and give you an uneven bobbin. Now, I haven't seen it cause a problem with the performance on the machine. I can talk to tech about it and see what that might mean. And if you want to email me with that question, then I'll be able to get directly back to you. Again, Myrl, M-Y-R-L, at TinLizzie18.com. Any other questions?
Do you recommend a closed foot or an open foot to do pantographs?
Now with pantographs, since I'm in the back of the machine, I don't have to see as much as if I was doing free motion or maybe going around appliques. So I don't think it really matters. I know a lot of people who keep the ruler foot on at all times because it has a bigger opening to see down into. But I don't think it really matters which one you use for pantograph.
Does the presser foot need to be down when adjusting upper tension?
Yes. If the pressure foot is up, there is no tension in your tension discs. If they're adjusted correctly, they're open and kind of flopping, so you wouldn't be able to adjust your tension. So make sure that you have your pressure foot down when you adjust tension. In fact, I suggest it always be down.
I have issues sometimes when it seems like the needle is not coming out of the fabric quick enough and it drags a little and skips stitches.
Okay, with this skipping stitches, double check and see if there's a needle punch between on the long stitch. If there's a needle punch, then we've got a little issue with your timing. If there's no needle punch, you have an issue with your encoders that we'll talk more about our next session because we'll be talking about the frame and carriage. So it sounds to me like if it's dragging a bit when you're in the regulated mode, that you might have a little loose connection with your encoders, but maybe even more likely they're not rolling smoothly on your frame. So the encoders are the little wheels on the back of your machine and on the side. Look and watch them as you move the machine and see if they're rolling smoothly. If they're slipping or they're not making contact with the rail, then it may not be rolling like it should, and so the machine thinks you're stopping or hesitating. Okay? We're coming close to the end. Are there any other questions?
Somebody wants to see a ruler foot.
Oh, okay. Well, let's put the ruler foot next to our original foot that comes with the machine. The first thing you notice is much bigger around, and it has a higher fence. This is the fence, and also it's square back here, whereas the one that comes with the machine has a slanted connection, so that with the ruler foot you can go clear around a circular template and have it make a perfect circle. If you try this with a circular one, you'll have a little bump out where that slant comes down. So this is a ruler foot. They're $49.99. Any other questions?
Sometimes there's a loop of the top thread on the back, about a ½ inch of thread, but the tension is good everywhere else.
Okay, on the top thread, it could be that your check spring, now remember your check spring is this little spring. I guess we're going to have to move the camera up a little bit. This check spring right here, this little wire, its job is to keep locking the stitch every time the needle goes up and down. It should be at 11 o'clock. Can you see where this loop is? Let me get my pen. Where this loop is right here of the spring, it should be at about 11 o'clock. If it's too far down, maybe more towards 10, then it wouldn't have as much of a pull on that spring. So double check your check spring, make sure it's at 11 o'clock. If it needs a slight adjustment, you can turn it by using this screw in the center. You don't want to change it grossly, but just slightly you can change it there. So that's what I would check, is that check spring.
If the top stitch looks good, but the back stitch looks straight, which do I need to adjust?
You need to adjust your needle thread. Now, if your bobbin tension was originally too tight, you might need to go back and start with that one. But if you are happy with your bobbin tension, then you'll need to adjust your top tension tighter.
My tension is fine, but all of a sudden I get eyelashes on the back. Why?
All of a sudden. There could be a few reasons. I'm thinking maybe it might have to do with the way your bobbin was wound. When that happens, I would take out my bobbin case and double check that the thread isn't stuck on something. Every once in a while, let me put this bobbin up where you can see it. Okay. Every once in a while, the thread might get pulled too far over this direction and actually get stuck there, and so then it would put more tension on your needle thread and cause it to make an eyelash. So when you put it in, just make sure it's not pulled too tight that way. Sometimes at the end of a bobbin that will happen if the bobbin was wound kind of awkwardly at the beginning of its winding. Anything else? We're coming close to our end, and it's been enjoyable to be with you, and I'm always open for questions on my email, so don't hesitate. Next time I mentioned that we're going to be talking about your table and carriage and how to load your quilt and how Merle loads her quilt, and we can share those ideas.
There's several questions about how to order her accessories like feet and things from TinLizzie.
You're able to email me, actually, and then I can pass it on to our ordering desk if you would like. Remember, Merle, M-Y-R-L, at TinLizzie18.com to order accessories. Well, it's been fun to be with you. Have a great day and happy quilting.